Why was Jesus such a big turning point in Judaism, which created Christianity? What was the main reason for Jesus that many people may not even realize, and has been something that's been repeated by the Muslims, the Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, and many others who have created their own religions? You see, in order to understand this, you have to say what made Jesus so special that 40, 50 years after the so-called events happened, that these stories came out. I mean, certainly in the first century, you had people like Judas of Galilee and Theudas and Simon of Perea who could easily be looked upon as first century messiahs. Yet the problem is that most of them in their revolts, they died, or they claimed themselves to be the Messiah, but they died. What was such a big deal to first century Jews that a Messiah had to come? And we will see the correlation to why so many modern day Christians need this Messiah to come as they prepare to celebrate his resurrection day. Well, when you go back and you look at how Yahweh came about during a time frame where everybody's gods, to which everybody believed that everybody's gods existed, that everybody's God had a place to live, a place where you can go and have your prayers listened to and possibly answered, a place that you can go and sacrifice to your God. You see, the Greeks had Mount Olympus, and that's where the gods dwelled. The Egyptian, the Kemetic people, had their different cities depending upon the time frame of Heliopolis and Thebes, which is where their gods dwelled, and they had temples by which their God dwelled in. Well, when the Canaanites who become Israelites separated themselves and came up with Yahweh and decided that Yahweh was going to be their God, they were instructed to build an Ark of the Covenant where this God power can exist, as well as a tent of meetings where this God can come down and reside with the Israelite people. Because remember, in Deuteronomy 32, to Yahweh, the Israelites were given as a people by Elion. So they had their tent of meetings. And then over time, as they became bigger, they built the temple. And so this God dwelled in the temple, and that's where the God of the Israelites dwelled. But unfortunately for them, the first temple was destroyed. And when the first temple was destroyed, then the prayers of the people cannot be heard by their God. So therefore, they needed a new Messiah, someone new to come in. So in comes David and then Solomon, and a new temple is built again. Now, God can listen to the prayers of the Israelites. Their prayers will be answered. They won't be enslaved. Everything will be perfectly fine until around 580, 560 BCE, when the Babylonians come in. And the Babylonians destroy the temple. Well, upon the destruction of the temple from 589, of course, there are prophecies now that a new king, a new Messiah will come. They even go as far as to tell King Azha that a young girl has given birth to a young man who will be the Messiah. They were looking for it. They were begging for it. They were asking for it with so much zeal that by the time the Persians come in and take over and a Messiah doesn't come and they can't rebuild the temple, and then the Greeks come in but they can't take over and build a temple. There's no Messiah. And then they thought for a second, the Maccabees started their revolt and was establishing a city-state within the Greek Empire. They thought for a moment that was going to be it. The Maccabees, royal lineage, would be their messiahs. But the Maccabees fell. That's why they hold a tribute to them in Masada to this day. But the Maccabees failed. And then in come the Romans. So we've had almost 600 years of no temple. Almost 600 years that God has not listened to the prayers, the calls, the sacrifices of the Israelites. 600 years that they've been waiting on a Messiah. And so you have your Judas of Galilee, who starts a revolt in Galilee against the Romans, but ultimately fails. Theudas, who claimed to be the Messiah and had a group of followers who followed him, but ultimately he was killed and failed. Simon Bar Giora started a revolt against Rome, a Jewish-Roman war, and many viewed him as a Messiah, but ultimately he failed as well. And so many more in the first century came, and every year would start revolts against the Roman Empire until finally, Rome said, we need to change the narrative. Vespasian had already demonstrated how he changed the narrative for the Druids in destroying them. We need to change the narrative. As long as they're waiting on a Messiah, they're going to keep starting revolts in Judea. And this is very important to our trade to hold this area in the Levant. So a new story was created. Although Josephus ben Matthias had wrote about these other first century Judeans who had started revolts against Rome, a new story had to be created. And in that new story, they backtracked the date to say that 30, 40, 50 years ago, the Messiah came. And the Messiah built the temple. He said, this temple will be torn down in 3 days and then rebuilt. But he was talking about a temple inside of you. You see, you don't have to go to the building to worship God. The temple is now the people. The church is now the people. A master stroke of genius in deciding that there is a difference. The Romans went to their temples to worship their different gods of Jupiter and Juno, and hey, they had their temples of worship, but the stroke of genius was to take away the temple building that was necessary to worship the Jewish God. In the same way, the Jewish people, when they separated from the Canaanites, they did not have any idols of Yahweh, whereas they had idols of El. They let the Canaanites keep that one, and they created something new, something different. Now the Romans are creating something new, something different for the Christians. You don't need a temple to offer your prayers to your God. I'm selling you a new hope, a new way of thinking, and many bought into it. And others began to write stories, and there's a formatted story that comes out about this Messiah who was a son of God, and he died and resurrected and performed these miracles. But then others said, oh, yes, and I can add to that and make the stories bigger and bigger. And then here comes Luke, and I wasn't there, but I heard other people talk about it, and I'm going to add and add and add. And John said, I'm going to make the story even bigger, even greater. And you have all these stories based on this. Some guy named Paul that no one can identify or find in history, that he wrote these letters concerning this guy. Yes, we're going to really facilitate this. But unfortunately for Rome, it got out of control. Just like anything else, it got out of control. And soon even the Christians began to fight amongst each other until for the next 400 years. But why Jesus over the others? The others were trying to establish and maintain the status quo of building a temple, of having freedom of Judea. So their ideas was an idea of reality. So instead, they chose a deity of the ether, of unreality, in order to satiate the people's needs. And it continues to satiate people's needs today, because just as they were looking for a Messiah, Christians today are still looking for the return of a Messiah that never was. And they will continue to look for it, just as people created new versions of it, whether it's the Muslims, the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists. There are always newer versions of the same old story. People looking for someone else to save them instead of looking inside yourself. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey.